Ever tried to set up a gig and the sub just fizzles? You get those sleek pics on the product page, the promises of earth-shaking low end, and then when you plug it in the room feels like it's missing half the punch. I've been there, and I know the hesitation that builds when you're about to spend a few $1,000s on a piece of gear that might end up sounding thin or, worse, be a logistical nightmare to move. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In today's review, I'm going to walk through the QSC KS118 active 18-inch subwoofer, break down what it actually does in a real-world environment, and help you decide whether it belongs in your rack or should stay on the shelf. First off, the KS118 sits in the sweet spot between a club-grade sub and a portable DJ solution. The 18-inch direct radiating driver paired with a 3600-watt Class D amplifier means you get a lot of output without the heat and weight penalties you'd see in older analog designs. In a recent house party test, the sub hit 100 dB SPL at 12 feet with just a modest 200W input from the mixer, and the low end stayed tight even when the bass guitar and kick drum were both feeding it simultaneously. That's the kind of confidence you need when you're the one responsible for the vibe of a night. What really sets this sub apart is the onboard DSP. QSC has built a suite of protection and optimization routines that keep the driver from clipping and the amp from overheating. When I pushed the volume past the point where most cheap subs start to distort, the DSP automatically dialed back the gain just enough to keep the waveform clean, then ramped it back up as the peak subsided. It's subtle, but in a live setting that can be the difference between a clean low-frequency thump and a blown-out mess that ruins a set. Portability is another practical concern that often gets glossed over in spec sheets. The KS118's enclosure is rugged, with rubberized corners and two sturdy handles that feel like they're made for a forklift. The weight is still around 100 pounds, so you're not going to lift it into a small venue without a dolly, but the design is clearly meant for touring crews. The M20 threaded pole receptacle, which accepts a 35mm pole, lets you stand the sub vertically on a standard speaker pole. I set it up on a 3-foot pole at a club's back-of-house, and it gave me a clean, focused low-frequency field without having to dig a hole in the floor or worry about the sub tipping over. Now let's talk about the deep mode. By default, the KS118 already reaches down to about 30 Hz, which is more than enough for most live music and DJ applications. When you flip into deep mode, the internal crossover shifts, extending the response to around 25 Hz. In practice, this means you feel the bass of a kick drum not just as a thump but as a physical rumble that can be felt in the chest. In a small theater test, the deep mode added just enough low end to make the soundtrack of an action scene pop without muddying the dialogue. If your primary use is electronic dance music or bass-heavy hip-hop, that extra extension can be a real game-changer. Who should consider buying the KS118? If you're a mobile DJ who frequently plays in venues ranging from bars to mid-size clubs, this sub gives you the headroom to crank the bass without worrying about clipping. It also fits nicely into permanent installations for churches, small concert halls, or rehearsal spaces where you want a reliable, high-output sub that can be locked down with the optional KSLOC security cover. The security cover is a nice touch for venues that leave equipment unattended. It prevents anyone from tampering with the DSP settings or the power controls, which can be a real issue when you have multiple crews rotating through a space. On the other hand, you might want to skip the KS118 if your primary focus is home theater. The sub is overkill for a living room setup, both in terms of power and size. You'd likely end up with a sub that dominates the room, making the rest of the system sound weak. Additionally, if you're on a tight budget, there are smaller, cheaper active subs that can deliver respectable bass for a typical party. The KS118's price point reflects its professional pedigree, and you'll need to budget for the transport gear dolly, pole, possibly a dedicated power strip because you won't be able to just set it down on a coffee table and forget about it. Practical strengths sum up to 3 main points: sheer output, intelligent DSP, and tour-ready design. The output is evident the moment you power it on. You can fill a 500-square-foot room with bass that feels like it's coming from the floor. The DSP keeps the sub honest, automatically protecting the driver while preserving clarity. And the design makes it survive the rigors of weekly road trips, which is a huge relief if you're constantly loading and unloading gear. Weaknesses.